Welcome back to JLF's Brave New World Season 3. Our magazine partner for this series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. In case any of you missed our earlier session today, The Brass Notebook, Devaki Jain, in conversation with Madhusri Lal, you can catch it on our YouTube and Facebook platforms. Our second session today is Tracking in the Age of the World Wide Web. Perry Chen and Monica Narula in conversation in partnership with Nature Mort. Traditionally, trackers were used to lead us to animals, people, or lost geographical features concealed in jungles and wilderness. Today, we need help in navigating the complex and bewildering world of technology. The two speakers in conversation today are aptly poised to clear much of the confusion and the unknowable factors involved in lifting the mists surrounding the virtual world of communication as it is today, and as it will be increasingly in the future. Perry Chen is an American artist and the creator of Kickstarter, an online funding platform for creative projects. Monica Narula co-founded the Raqs Media Collective with the avowed intention of forcing viewers to look anew at everyday sights taken for granted. Perry Chen is an artist and founder of Kickstarter. He approaches his work with an openness to form and context, having used art to explore technology and technology to help democratize the funding of creative work. In 2013, Time magazine named him one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Monica Narula formed Raqs Media Collective in 1992, along with Jibesh Bakshi and Shuddhabrata Sengupta. Raqs practices across several media, making installations, sculpture, video, performance, text, lexica, and curation. Their work finds them at the intersection of contemporary art, philosophical speculation, and historical inquiry. They were the artistic directors for the recently concluded Yokohama Triennale 2020, Afterglow, where they developed sources around toxicity, care, and the luminosity of friendship with artists and the public. Please do remember to ask questions and comment by typing it into the comment section below, and we will pose these of Monica and Peter. Ladies and gentlemen, tracking in the age of the World Wide Web, Perry Chen and Monica Narula in conversation in partnership with Nature Mort. Perry, Monica, over to you guys.
Thank you.
Well, thanks, Sanjoy. That was it's actually quite a joy to be here and to talk to Perry, who's, well, Kickstarter we all know of, but I'm not going to actually start talking about that because I guess everyone can, or maybe we'll get to that later, Perry. But what I wanted to start with actually was by bringing in a recension to the spin on the idea of history, right? So we've heard history repeats itself, which was Hegel, and we have history repeats itself as tragedy and farce, which is Marx. Then we have history never really says goodbye, it always says see you later, which is Eduardo Galeano. And then I recently read what you wrote, which is history does not repeat, it rhymes. So I find it quite a generative kind of starting point because it's the play of language is always, I mean, playing with language is always a productive way of opening things out. You know, we have a work that we made a few years ago called Corrections to the First Draft of History. So, you know, especially when newspapers think of themselves as the first draft of history. So, you know, that's, and we said, you know, there's a certain assumption of how history is being written. How does one then go back and look at it again and write it or rewrite it, correct it? But the idea was not just the fact that one can rewrite it, but also how one reads things differently. That's the operative sort of idea, not just the fact that you can scratch something out and write on it. And just the idea of after readings and how after readings change how one looks at things. And I wanted to ask you the sense of rhyming that you're talking about in that phrase, at least, which I believe is, yeah, in that phrase, which implies also a sense of pattern recognition, right, at the heart of it, that one can see something and one finds echoes of it and sees, you know, what rhyme can mean. And I wanted to just ask you how you saw that in relationship to time, to broader ideas of time.
Thank you, Monica. Yeah, I think this is a really good question. Yeah, this is the quote. History doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. So first, this I had heard this phrase for much of my life, and at some point I heard that it was Mark Twain, the American author, who had originally said this. And as I was doing research for the show that I'm about to open, I wanted to integrate this term into one of my works, and I found out that actually the provenance is unknown. Even though it is often attributed to Mark Twain. He wrote a similar line, but not too similar. And I really like that too, because reading a lot of quotations and aphorisms, you find this to be quite common, this kind of misattribution of words. And you start to realize that even things maybe said 150 years ago, we're not quite sure always who said them. And they may be attributed to just somebody who had a similar sense of wit or philosophy. So there was something just about that dissolution of time, that almost like these things were just like, we attribute them, it's almost like before the photograph in a way. It's like the time before where everything's an approximation. The concept itself and the resonance of that history is not repeating itself, but it rhymes is two things. I think one is that history doesn't repeat itself, meaning that we live in perpetual novelty, which is actually also the name of the show, but that things are always changing and that they are always new. But of course, when you say that, you also have to reflect on the fact, well, there are some things that don't feel that way. We often have feelings that, wow, I've done this before. I feel like I've lived this pattern before. I feel like when coronavirus is hit, and then we all look back at the Hong Kong flu, at the Spanish flu of 1918, and we see all these things where we are not thinking about these things. And then you look back and you see the photos and you see the people and you're like, wow, like, are we just living in history, repeating it? Now, they didn't have, they're not surfing the web, they're not on their iPhones, everything is radically different. But also we ask, is the fundamental maybe the same? One other thing that I've been thinking about in the last few years that touches on this, which is that with our digital technology, social media, there is this feeling that like the information ecosystem has never been like it is now. That there were so many different voices and so many different agendas and people not sticking to the truth and saying anything they want. But I think back probably, if you imagine 100 years ago, so I'm from New York City, and I think probably New York City 100 years ago, 120 years ago, probably had 40 newspapers, 40 daily newspapers for the Irish community, for the Italian community, for the the Eastern European Jewish community, probably each of those had 4 newspapers that competed, and if they all probably said things that were just to the agenda that group had or the publisher had. And so have we maybe experienced some of what we're seeing now back then, where there was a massive amount of misinformation and disinformation, even from the churches and the synagogues and the temples and whatever, and what can we learn, right? What can we learn from that? Not just about how that was navigated, but also how do we learn to not always look at our moment as that it's unprecedented. So it is novel, but it is not wholly novel, right? So we can, in the sense of we can learn from these past sub patterns, even as we exist in perpetual novelty.
Yeah, I mean, that's it is a question of sort of looking at history and finding traces that one can learn from, I suppose. But what I think is also interesting is that the idea of history itself, I mean, certain philosophical strands, whatever, is considered a capacity to be able to gauge the fact that the past can be read in a certain way. So for someone like him, there were those who could understand the fact that there is a capacity for history, that that capacity, history as a capacity could be processed, and the rest of the world was terra incognita, or as some developmentalists would have it, the rest of us, the messy world that does not fit into. So I'm interested in this question of like, what is this idea of capacity that one is looking at when when you're looking at a certain kind of recent history? Well, you're looking at history of 100, 150 years. And I am interested also in thinking about the Spanish flu, which I'll talk about it later. But I'm just interested in how in this new world where things that have not happened in waves, we have a certain kind of velocity. There's more vectors at play than there have been before. Simply, I think, because of technological, ramifications that make this conversation possible, for example, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. So when in this kind of new patterns, where there are patterns that one can recognize, but where those who would not have been considered part of history earlier. So these are new, I think they're new, new, ruptures at play, new factions being developed. I'm just wondering, as someone who has thought about the relationship between technology and a certain way of looking at time, at least, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, let me see how to think about this. What I'll say when you're talking, what it makes me think of is one of the interviews I did in research for this project was with the computer pioneer Danny Hillis, who has a concept of the entanglement, which is a kind of, he says that we had the Enlightenment and now we're in the entanglement. One of the things we were talking about was, okay, we live in a world possibly of three natures. We have Mother Nature, human nature, and then human-made nature. All of our technologies now kind of as a force on their own with urges and tendencies that we are just understanding. But when I talked to him about this, I was wondering what are the differences that we could point out between these three natures. And the thing he said that stuck with me was that Mother Nature has no memory. So and then thinking of what you're saying, Mother Nature, in a sense, has no care for history. Mother Nature is just going. She is just going, right? And randomly, biologically experimenting and continuing on in life. And it makes me think that this is a very human thing, this memory. I mean, animals may have memory, but it's not like, it may be about that something that happened yesterday or about where they should go to find food, not the kind of historical kind of documentation that we have to talk about 50 generations ago or 10 generations ago. So there's this kind of, maybe you make me think about the uniquely human construct of this kind of longer term history. And maybe that's one window into thinking about it as well.
I mean, history as one form of narration. I mean, there's research which apparently says that there's more memory in non-human species than we know of, and there's like new thoughts on this all the time. But I know what you mean, and I'm also touched by this idea that not enlightenment but entanglement. I mean, the triennial that we curated recently, one of the keywords in that had been the idea of luminosity as kind of starting source idea. The fact of and as we were laughing amongst ourselves, like luminosity, not enlightenment. What is lit from, what glows allows a certain other way of seeing the environment than that which is being lit from without. And then it creates different kind of capacities both to see and to illuminate, but also speaking of the Spanish flu, I mean, just thinking of 100 years ago, since we are on the historical turn, we had worked on recently a piece which was looking at the anniversary of the First War. And it was looking but also at the experiences of Indian soldiers from the empire, but from this part of the world, who had fought in various theaters for the British Empire. And what was interesting is, I mean, we called it Not Yet at Ease, and the fact that, history does not allow you to reach a point of ease. And there is that sort of, I mean, the 100 years, I mean, the Great War of the Great First World War, its implications, the ramifications are still being felt in so many parts of the world. So we are still not yet at ease. So this question of the patterns we see, historical kind of echoes, that remains in sort of interesting and open question. But what I'm also interested in is how situations of friction or of kind of collective trauma, such as the Spanish flu, such as the pandemic, such as the Great War, also create new new possibilities, whether they're tangential or that or not remains always to be seen. And I'm thinking especially of the work of Ramani Kahal, whose work you have referenced in your upcoming project, right? The neurons, the traumatized neuron, the injured neuron. Actually, we had shown his paintings. We had curated an exhibition at the MACBA Museum in Barcelona, where we had actually shown Ramani Kahal.
Fantastic.
It is brilliant, isn't it? But what I wanted to also just think aloud on, since we are talking about entanglement, is the fact that it is the injured neuron that allows us to see pathways. I mean, that's what Kahal's work permitted, was to understand the path of the way things moved in the body. And it was because of the injury that one could figure out the path, as it were. I'm just wondering if you, since we are talking in all of this, if you have.
Yeah, what you're saying also makes me think of like, there was the great quote, I won't remember who said it, but it said that something like, every happy family is the same, every unhappy family is unique, you know? And I think there's some truth to this kind of concept about the trauma, the unpleasant experiences, the lack of smoothness, right? That we face individually, collectively, voluntarily or involuntarily. So much of this becomes who we are, whether as a culture, as a family, as individuals. And so, of course, we want to, many of these things we want to eliminate and minimize, or learn to better negotiate, learn to better carry ourselves through. But the idea of totally eliminating all these things, in a way, maybe leaves us with, who would we be, right? Who would we be? So many people I know that we all know that had very challenging childhoods, would say, you know, of course, I would never want to live it again, but I wouldn't change it, because that would then change who I am now. In a way. And so, and of course, you have other people who said, I would totally change it, because there are some things I haven't been able to wrangle. And maybe that's part of it, which is just, it's about, what are we able to do with those things? In a way, it's also the superpower for some people, right? The strength from their own, for being forced to find a way to overcome something, and to be a person on the other side, or be a family on the other side. And so it's one of the most complicated things we have to deal with, because we cannot stop trying to build a world where people suffer less of this trauma. However, there is part of that is who we are. So it's like that's a very interesting balance to try to find.
Yeah, I suppose that's. But I was just wondering, in terms of the pandemic, do you sort of speculate in terms of, what this moment of injury is going to? I mean, looking back at histories of various kinds of plagues, or, dramatic sort of moments that are not individual, or not individual trauma, not war, but just like you don't really know how to process things, which is what, that sense of collective disbelief, right? That I think is a very interesting point of this pandemic as well. There was a collective, and there still is a bit of, it's kind of fading, but to me, that collective disbelief also allowed for, because assumptions are no longer, obviously they're, so what does it, where does that take us?
No, thank you for reorienting me. It's such an amazing opportunity. I mean, it's obviously, in many ways, it's a terrible tragedy for the people who are sick and dying, and people losing their jobs. So, but we have to also allow it to be the opportunity that it is. Anything that kind of shakes things up opens up opportunity. Doesn't mean we'll seize it, but it means that because the way that you were doing things before, that sometimes people thought, well, that's how it has to be done. Like for now, we've seen, work now and going to people being able to be remote. So I think that has great meaning for non-US population, I think that means there's going to be more jobs that probably were only going to be in the US, and in the US, even only in the California and New York, that now will be available to people in other areas of the US and around the world. And then I know different countries, they threw away kind of their monetary policies where they're like, we can't print more money and we can't do this. The things they said they can't do and they could never do, and then they did. So that breaking of some of these kind of like hard and fast rules and beliefs allows for other things to be challenged that maybe people said can never change or are impossible to change. I think also, we've all probably seen, it's a moment of personal reflection as well, right? You're spending so much time on your own or with just your family, a much smaller group of people, much more time. And so I'm sure people are, thinking about, what am I doing? What do I want to be doing this? And so there's this auditing that we have of ourselves, maybe our endeavors. So, I think if we thankfully, we have not had a world war in a long time, or a great war. And if this happens to be our version of it, I think, it's better than any of those versions of it. If we can take what you often learn from those things, that go on 10 years and 50 million people have to die.
Yeah.
And we can learn similar lessons without having to go through that kind of thing. Then that would be great. I read, somebody posted something about a study, something saying like, if the Spanish flu happened right now, that it would probably have had the same amount of deaths. And I thought that was interesting too, because what they were saying was that the medical advances would have probably ended up in a similar place that we have right now, the same deaths as COVID. So, when I thought about the Spanish flu before, I was thinking, well, we're lucky we don't have that, because wow, that killed tens of millions of people. But this kind of recontextualized it for me that even whether or not this was accurate, that what we are dealing with now may have killed 50 million people if we didn't have the infrastructure, the treatment, and then of course getting a vaccine earlier than anybody expected. So it's like when you have an earthquake, there's an earthquake somewhere and there's still great damage and people still may die, but you may hear about, well, 100 years ago there was an earthquake of a similar size and 10 times as many people died or something, because the construction was worse and the care was worse, and you would get, if you got injured in a certain way, you would just get an infection. And so you do think that this is kind of a line of progress between the past and the present? I'm curious. I mean, this idea that we are on the better path. Do you think this is a kind of a relationship between technology and human capacity, or is it just because we are? I don't know. I'm interested in this question because I'm not always convinced that progress is like a linear line. Yeah, I agree with you. I'm not saying better. I mean, I can say that specifically we know how to survive better. Right?
Yeah,
we know how to make humans survive better. Of course, the opposite side of that is now we live in a world that where humans are living longer than ever before and will continue. And we're going to have to deal with what that means to have a much larger, older population. I was reading something a few years ago, which I can never forget. People were being asked, what should we be worried about that nobody is thinking? And two people answered underpopulation, which was quite shocking, right? Because, you would think overpopulation, but they said that basically it seems that as we go towards 9 or 10 billion, that pretty much all the estimates predict that we will peak there and start to come down because more and more countries are becoming richer, higher standard of living, and the birth rate always drops to correlate with that. And once it gets below 2.1 births per family, it's below replacement level, right? We see this in Italy and Japan and some other countries that are already dropping in population. They said this, coupled with the ability to extend life much longer, but with medical science, means that you're going to have a decreasing amount of people in the working age and a smaller number of children. So what this means, though, is that the family structures are going to look very different, right? Because they're going to be much more people in the older generations. And then even emotionally, you may have a couple with a child is more likely to only have one child. So you have one at the bottom, the parents, two at the top. Their four parents are more likely to be alive than ever before. Their four parents are still more likely to be alive than ever before. So you might have this pyramidical kind of structure. And then you think about the cost for the care. Mm-hmm. And it's not just the cost in the dollars, the cost, it's the time, this great granddaughter, well, all of the grandparents are going to want to see, but she has 8 of them, and then also 4 grandparents and 2 parents. And what will it be like with these societies where, that's the emotional kind of shape of the family in a way, and
no, that's actually that's fantastic image, a kind of a pyramid teetering on a single point as opposed to the large kind of base of it. But I think this question of like how negotiating this present and not so far future world, which is growing in complexity and uncertainty, right? That's something I think you've also posed somewhere, and we all have at different points thought it, read it, said it, tried to sort of reflect on what one can do with this question itself, right? I think the order of question always makes for a different order of answer. As a matter of fact, I know that you're interested in the idea of the question because, our last exhibition that we curated, the Shanghai Biennial, was actually called "Why Not Ask Again?" The importance of asking again, because this just the fact that you think an answer has been given does not mean that an answer is adequate.
100%. Or the answer changes as time changes.
Yeah, exactly. So, but the question also then is, I'm just thinking of this little girl dealing with all these grandparents, but I'm also thinking of the relationship with, the ubiquity of the machine, right? I mean, I'm not, for me, the human relationship with technique has always been a fascinating one. I mean, whether it's got to do with thinking on any kind of, from spectacles that we wear to, we have had prostheses for a very, very long time. And then how do, from that point, from just helping you to see something, but to extending the capacity of what it means to be human, like that's where the kind of possible new frontier is. But at the same time, we cannot also deny that sometimes the world seems to be sort of impetuously dashing into self-declared, not declared, but self-generated stupidity. Some days can be rather dark. I mean, depends on how you're feeling about climate change, for example. But that is just one meta. There are so many other things, and we all live in different societies that we have to deal with the challenges and complexity surrounding us. What I'm interested in is, what are your vectors of negotiation of this? Like this relationship, say, between us incapacity and our capacity, this kind of dynamic between how we can and we don't, or we do and that play. I mean, what are your vectors for that? I mean, I can talk about mine after this in an attempt, but just curious.
Wow, it's a fantastic question. So yes, of course, it's very daunting, right, when we think about the future. And a big reason it is because, we have so much information now. So, it's there's an overload of information that we're receiving, and it's what, even if it's all true, even if we're smart enough to detect what is and what isn't, it's just a lot, right? You're talking about massive things, climate change, prosthetic futures. So it's in many ways very easy to be paralyzed by such things. So I think first you have to, would be to not be paralyzed. And I think that one of the things that I found in researching this project and the question of how do we learn to negotiate a world of growing complexity and uncertainty, there's a work I did called "We Are Not Them." And this really is a helpful thing for me because what I realize is we always ask these questions about like, what do we do? Like, what is the future we're trying to create? And of course, we do have a responsibility. We're here, we leave something behind. And of course, with climate crisis, this is of course a huge part of this conversation. But other than that, we also have our values, and we try to shape the world according to our values. Of course, we have different values, and there's battles between these values that happen within families and within nations and within religions and cultures. And in these things where we really try to shape the world because we think we can predict it, a lot of it is because we imagine the future is just in 50 years, in 100 years, it'll just be us, the future us.
Mm-hmm.
Like we imagine if we're in 100 years and all these technologies are happening and this climate crisis is accelerated, what do we feel and what do we want? So the climate stuff is easier because we could say, yes, of course, people do not want to have their lives and their natural resources threatened by so that's an easier one. But beyond that, how do we have the humility to not overly shape the future? Because the people that are here in 100 years may have different values from us. They may have different desires from us. There are things that are fundamentally human, but you can also imagine 100 years ago and ask, how much would we want somebody 100 years ago to decide what today is? And so that kind of lessens a bit of the responsibility. You know what I mean? It means that you do have certain things that are a responsibility, like I think we do with climate crisis and other things that we may be causing or pushing forward. But this other responsibility to shape the future in all these ways, you have to be careful with that because it's very hubristic, you know? You have to approach it really with humility and try to do things, I think, that create a flexible future, meaning one that where the people who occupy that future can use their agency with maybe the tools and systems we've created that are flexible to shape that world into what they want, not to be constantly trying to unwind some sort of hardened path we may have locked in for them.
No, absolutely. I think that's exactly the point, right? But what it does open up, exactly as you're saying, but what is this ethics into the future? That's, I think, becomes the operative question. Not so much what is it one prescribes into the future, but what is it that one offers as a kind of non-didactic, but as a kind of heuristic or a starting point or something that one can offer to.
Sure.
To I mean, you said you have a child coming. I have a daughter who's and but see what the things that we've talked about and written about. I mean, we already talked about luminosity over enlightenment, or entanglement over enlightenment at least, and the fact that a certain way of looking at knowledge that is granted from without is maybe to be looked at again. Another one that we've thought a lot about is the idea of the autodidactic approach, right? How does one?
I see what you're saying. So let me take from that and offer two things. So one, coming off of what I was saying before, is this concept of long-term thinking, not long-term planning. And several people that I talked to in research in this said some version of this to me. Basically, that we can't, that the future is unpredictable. And so when you play the game of prediction, what you do is you'll design for this future you predict will happen. But if it doesn't happen that way, then what you've built may not fit what exists. So how do you try to how do we stop trying to play the game of prediction and more do long-term thinking, which is about creating flexible systems that can fit many possible futures? So that long-term thinking, not long-term planning, is one. The other one, I think, is just simplicity. I think it's just in the simplification of our systems. I think that we have to not just solve the problems of complexity, which include technology, include also our legal systems and our all these massively complex things with more complexity, not keep solving complexity with more complexity. We have to be able to, as part of progress, has to be simplification with intent, right? We have to learn to understand the value of simplification because I think there's a great cost The more complex something is, it's harder for people to understand it. This is not a good system. The best systems work when people understand it. And so even if you could say that this system that's very complex is fairer, I don't know if it's superior to a simpler system that people can themselves understand, because the problem is complex systems cease to function well in times of low trust.
Low trust.
Yeah, low trust. If it's a time of low trust, complex systems cease to function well because they require trust from people. That I trust the way that system was designed is not just to be taken advantage of by the people that have power. At times of low trust, like we are in now, that's what happens. You don't trust the vaccine. You don't trust the privacy policies. You don't trust the tax system where people cheat and hide their billions of dollars. And this is the thing. If the complexity is not strong enough to deal well with in times of low trust.
Yeah. So do you think, okay, now this, I must reference the elephant in the room, at least for some people, which is Kickstarter. Do you think that something like Kickstarter, which I think it is going to be a useful model more into the future, as we go into the future, simply because it allows people to sort of jump that long, complicated, I would say, not so much complex, but that long, complicated method that certain sort of systems are put in place for you to access any kind of possible directions that, for funding, etc. And I think a lot of artists, for sure, might be looking at it more and more. But this intersection between, and I do think, for example, as people have pointed out, that because of the fact that Kickstarter exists, so many people have actually done so much and tried out so many things. So, and now we do have a moment when the question of solidarity becomes into play again, right? Because moments of crisis, pose that question differently than in moments of non-crisis, and questions of sustainability. So, which keeping in mind this last 10 minutes of our conversation is still very pertinent. I'm just curious, do you think that what is the play between solidarity and sustainability vis-a-vis technological possibilities where creative acts and processes are possible? You know what I mean? Like Kickstarter is one platform, and I know that you've been trying out other experiments. I can't remember the name of your cafe space, but we had, many years ago, we began a place called Sarai, which was a place for, interdisciplinary working between research and practice. And, it did all sorts of things as well. So I think there are, at different moments, different places, people try out things so that one can open up this question between solidarity and sustainability. Like, what models can one create, offer, share that allow this play? I think Kickstarter is one of them, but I'm just wondering if you want to bring, speculate on some others, or you're thinking of something else?
Well, I think it's endless. It's endless. I think that designing social interactions or community interactions, it's endless. We have online tools to become a part of that as well. And we're doing something right now that 1918 we couldn't have done. We would have just not been able to meet and talk. So it's a lot of this is about intent, right? Are people going to have the intention to design these things? And I think that been in a time where there's this massive amount of commercial design, especially online, using kind of around social things, but mostly to business ends. Meaning that they're really not to the human ends. Now, it's great if they can do something positive for people in the middle of that, because obviously that makes people want to use it, at least at first. And so I think a lot of the things that we've failed to do are actually the challenge with people deciding to take up those design challenges, right? We have the giant opportunity for people still to design a better social network. Facebook will not always be the hegemonic thing. It doesn't ever happen that way. It always ends at some point. So that is sitting out there for the better thing to come along. Same for operating systems, iOS and Android. They look like maybe you'll only have these two forever, but no, there are so many opportunities for people to come along and design better systems that have real human value. They will have less commercial value, I assure you, but that's fine. The other part of this is the governance. Is that a huge part of what Facebook is not just the code. It's the governance of Facebook. And there's, of course, the governance now that people are talking about, which is, say, the governance around content, where they have that new kind of committee, advisory board that is reviewing like what policies they may or may not have about hate speech and misinformation. But it's also the fact that it is locked into a governance by the nature of being an American C corporation, which by law is mandated to maximize shareholder value, so to optimize for profit. That's the ultimate governance of this organization, and pretty much 99% of at least American companies. Kickstarter is different. We're a public benefit corporation, which is an alternative structure where our mandate is not to maximize profit, but to balance profit with our mission to help creative projects come to life and being sustainable and responsible. And so there may be other ways to do this. And in Europe and in other countries, they all have different laws. But when we're talking about the design of these things, you're not just talking about the design of, say, the social network the interface. There's the rules of how the platform is governed and what's allowed and what's not. And then there's the governance of the organization itself that operates it. And the design at all of those layers will offer us totally new opportunities we're in this moment where technology is new, and it takes a while to figure this stuff out.
No, actually, we've also been writing and thinking on this business of how sort of infrastructural thinking or thinking on infrastructure is actually a very important and creative act. Like it's not administration, right? It's not just a question of we are the creative people and then they are we have to think about what something hangs on is what it is. And that, I think, this separation does not exist between the structure of something and what it can do, because they are actually the same thing. And that is something I think which we need to sort of need to talk about it much more in this of what is broadly called the creative realm, because it seems to have bifurcated itself. That's one partition of the which I think needs to be blurred. I'm getting messages from the team here that perhaps we might be under. I don't know. Do you want to talk about something else? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure how to end this conversation, because I feel like this could probably go on longer. I mean, I have other thoughts. I mean, this, for example, I think we're at this moment where what Raqs is calling a perennial exhibition, in a sense, in the sense that there's always proximity because of the internet. For example, there's always art, right? I mean, the question of whether art is only something to be looked at, the way it is often placed, or is it something to be entangled with, is something we've all thought about, or how one can, and I mean, the number of micro conversations that I've been part of, and I see people all around me, it's just a micro gathering up exponentially in the last month. So what is our relationship with this perennial, relationship with art that is now all around us? Are we going to go back and just like, let it go and go back to someone is asking us if we could speak on the effort to simpler systems in contrast with complex, with the idea of intersectionality. Rachel Cooper is asking, with the idea of intersectionality. That's a really good point. I mean, because I think this is both this part of things, like how does one speak with and across? Do you want to go? Do you want to have a go at this?
Sure. Could you repeat it one more time for me, please?
Can you speak to the effort to simpler systems in contrast with complex, with the idea of intersectionality?
Yeah, I in no way think that the integration of intersectionality needs to over complexify a system to a point where that is becoming the burden on the system. I think it's more that complexity starts to inhibit all systems, regardless of what they are at some point. So I know that, as a concept alone, it may seem like, intersectionality is complicated, but it's the complex systems really mean like that they are adapting and evolving, and it is becomes unpredictable because of emergent behaviors. And so the example is a tax system where, the tax laws are being changed all the time, and there's probably no person that could tell you what the US tax law is at any one time. So how does complexity and intersectionality relate?
I mean, to me, there seems to be like they're not at cross purposes at all, in the sense that I don't think acknowledging the fact that there's multiple axes to something makes it more complex. I mean, in the sense that it is, again, to me, it's a dispositional question, right? Like how you approach something rather than is it the kind of methodology that you follow? And I think that so I don't think it's a question of simple and complex in that sense.
I think a great way to maybe talk about it is Einstein says that things should be as simple as they should be, but no simpler. Meaning that what I'm most talking about in simplification is not to dumb things down or to simplify them beyond the point where they integrate the necessary components, but to not have the excess complexity continually burdening its ability to do what we want it to do. One example for this is with like software or apps. If you remember the first time you probably used Facebook or something, it was probably much simpler. And then every year, it's like the thing now, it's like trying to use Photoshop if you use Facebook. I mean, it's like, you don't even know what the 100 buttons. And it happens with everything that we've used software wise, right? Like it just becomes so burdensome, because when you take something away, there's all these people say, oh no, I used that thing, you can't take it away. So you always add. And we create this complexity. It just happens through inertia. And it takes needing to say, like, no, we're going to cut out a lot of this stuff. We're going to simplify it. And then, it becomes easier to use. We saw this with moving to cell phones. They were forced to simplify software. And what happens is everybody rather uses the stuff on their cell phone. But they could have decided to make it simpler on our computers too. But it takes like somebody with really strong belief in simplicity to do that, because you have to withstand people everybody has an agenda for a piece of the complexity, right? Same with the tax rule. You want to simplify it. Okay, but everybody has an agenda. Each rule you want to take off, there's 1,000 people that want it to stay in. So yeah, I will go with that Einstein as that things should be as simple as they should be, but no simpler.
No less.
They need to be as they need to be, but no simpler. Yes. Thank you for your question.
Sanjoy is here.
Thank you, Monica Narula. Thank you, Perry Chen. Things should be made simpler. You're absolutely right, especially when we're looking at the world outside presently from this particular lens. The simpler it is, the better it is. This was an absolutely fascinating conversation, and we could have continued this forever and ever, but unfortunately we have to stop. Apologies to everybody who sent in questions. We were only able to get one out to our speakers because it was really quite a fascinating session. Thank you, Perry Chen. Thank you, Monica Narula, for that conversation, supported by Nathan Moore. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monica.
Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. And we'll log back on Monday, the 21st of December, for our next JLF Brave New World Voices of Faith session. Across boundaries, the spirit of Christmas. Michael Williams, Margaret Alva, John Verghese, Paul Swaroop in conversation with Deepak Mukherjee. Spirit and joy of Christmas evokes different memories for each of us. Eminent speakers provide insights into the idea of Christmas and delve deep into the roots and its philosophy. And that's at 7:30 p.m. IST, 2 p.m. GMT, and 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And on the 23rd of December, for the next set of JLF Brave New World, a series, look out for the information. This will be at 7 p.m. IST, 1:30 p.m. GMT, 8:30 a.m. EST. Till then, stay safe, stay masked, stay out of trouble.